Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be on the podcast and talk about your incredible paintings. So thank you.
I'm so excited. Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. I was just talking to Jennifer before we started recording that I have been a fan of your work for some time, and I selfishly curated her into a show because I wanted to see her paintings in person because there's an incredible layering effect that the paint that I felt like I just had to see in person. So I can't wait to talk about all of the things that are going on in your work.
Yeah.
All right. So, one of the ways I really love to start these conversations is by learning a little bit more about you and your background, like where you're from and really how you started to come into the art. So, if you could share a little bit about that with us, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I grew up outside of Philadelphia in the suburbs. Havertown was the name of the town. We used to call it Have No Town because there's not too much there, like, high school and a pizzeria. And I, ever since I was little, always found escape and comfort in drawing. And I definitely was someone who just like dove into that as a kid. There's all kinds of drawings that my mom has saved, and most especially amazed by the fact that she saved this little napkin holder that I painted in like kindergarten or something. And it's pink, orange, red, and yellow, which were my favorite colors, all of them all together. And they're like little girls with like flowers that are as big as they are on it. So some similar avenues that I was exploring as a little one, nature and color. But yeah, I was always that kid in school who was like the best drawer in arts class, or a voted class artist in 12th grade. And yeah, I just sort of knew. I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And lately I've been like grafting on an interpretation of nature experience that I had when I was younger, that I feel like was really generative, without necessarily knowing it at the time. But looking back, I realized, yes, like this is sort of the origin of a lot of what I'm doing right now. And that is that in my town, there's a Superfund site. I mean, I think it's sort of been cleaned up now, but there was this kind of story and history about the neighborhood having been polluted. And the more I read into it, it wasn't just like recent pollution, factory runoff. I think in the 70s and 80s, maybe the factory was closed in like as late as like 1991 or something like that. And even earlier, like 19th century and before, there was a weapons manufacturing, gunpowder mill. There were dye companies where like the runoff would go into this creek. Now, I loved this creek. It's called Carricon Creek. I used to walk home from school and take the long way so I could walk along this creek, not knowing that it had this sort of history of all this crap having been dumped in it. But there were ruins around the creek. There was like a colonial era cabin, and abandoned kind of ruins, and like a bridge with graffiti on it. And it was sort of the site of teen misbehavior, drugs and whatever. So it was very special to me. And I definitely grew up knowing that there had been pollution. The last little bit of that is that there was this overabundance of 4 and 5 leaf clovers in my lawn that my friend and I were obsessed with finding. This one year, we were like, what happened here? This is totally the result of some kind of mutation. So yeah,
That's incredible. I've only found like one 4-leaf clover, side note, and I always look for them. So
I
that's
know.
like
No,
crazy.
it was so weird. We actually like wrote a song about it that we would sing while we were digging. It was called "It's Time to Dig in the Dirt for 4-Leaf Clovers." That was the song.
I love that. And it's incredible too that you're at this point with your work and in your life, and you're looking back and seeing those formative experiences that really lay the groundwork for a lot of who we become, right? And as you were describing, like I'm like picturing it, and I can see, of course, like like these moody spaces you have in your paintings now that you want to be in, but you're also a little bit not scared of, but there's something kind of going on in it. Reminds me of like a kid seeing this space and having like this mythology of the creek, and then also like the teenage stuff even happening that you don't quite understand yet, like you're in that middle space.
Yeah. Yes, totally. I mean, I knew something special happened to me every time I went there or walked by it. I remember just like lollygagging and picking flowers in the spring and being like, oh, I need to be, I don't know, more into, I had this sense I wanted to merge with nature, like as a teen. So definitely looking back on that.
I love that. And then after you graduated from in Pennsylvania, can you talk a little bit? You went to PAFA, right? Is that's where you went to undergrad?
I did. I went to Carnegie Mellon for a year before I went to PAFA. And now just like thinking about it, that even in Pittsburgh, the sunsets were extra beautiful and colorful. And everybody would talk about how the reason they were so beautiful is because there was pollution happening. Yeah. And then I moved back to Philadelphia and I went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and I took some academic classes at Penn. They had a cool joint program where you could get the best of both worlds. And of course, at the Academy, I don't know if you know much about it, but it's very much a old-fashioned, like 19th century academy where you draw and paint from life. And there's this beautiful cast hall in the back of the museum where we would draw. And there was also like an animal drawing class. There would be these classrooms behind the museum, the cast hall, which had like a life-size Michelangelo's David, casts of the Parthenon frieze, Roman busts, like all of these amazing ancient sculptures in reproduction. And I also remember this animal drawing class where the teacher would bring in animals from the Philadelphia Zoo, like a horse, like a hawk. So now, again, I'm talking about it and I'm realizing, oh my God, it was all there. The ancient Greek sculpture that you couldn't tear me away from that room. I just would draw and draw and draw for hours. And then the animals, there it all is.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I love it because, I want to talk more about the sculptures in a minute in your work and mythology, etc. But yeah, like these little pieces that have come to you, but you did take a little bit of a roundabout in terms of making. And I think as artists, we have to try different things, explore, figure out who we are. Could you just briefly for a minute just talk about getting out of graduate school, making the work that you were making, and kind of landing where you are now with these beautiful paintings that talk about nature, mythology, the sculptures, animals, symbolism of it?
Yeah, I mean, when I was wrapping up with grad school and just after, I would say my work, which was so long ago now.
Oh, I know. The other day I was literally like,
hi.
Like 20 years or something. Like, I don't even know.
Yeah, 20 plus years. But back in the olden days, were cell phones. Anyway, I was making paintings that were definitely exploring color. I was painting in oil at the time, and I was really interested in a sort of acidic, like heightened color palette, noticing optical buzzes at the edges of forms. I had an awareness of what I wanted to, like, just letting my hand move with the medium in a way that felt comfortable. So I had a sense of how medium meets the specific my body, right? And I knew that I found like interest and comfort and ease in drawing. So they were about how to take that energy and comfort into the paintings, because paintings, of course, are always like a little more challenging to navigate. So there were these woozy, wavy drawing lines, and I was painting figures and animals, but very drawn. And they were in these settings that were also like woozy, wavy shapes, like biomorphs with kind of strange, like little surrealist eruptions of figures, little cartoony. More than one person at the time were like, this looks like Amy Sillman, because, you know, before she started making her abstract work, of course, she made these beautiful little figurative, like the line was just so exquisite and the color in her work. And for sure, I was looking at her work all the time. And I think I kind of started to drift away from that because people were always telling me it looks like her work. So, you know, you have to kind of work through your influences, your art heroes. And of course, you know, it never really looks like their work. But in grad school and when you're young in your 20s, people love to, you know, remind you over and over again about how derivative your work is from other people.
Oh, yes. I'm like, is this like a whole portion where like the faculty people in grad school are like, okay, let's just really grind them down in terms of
Oh
this.
God, grind you down. And it wasn't for me at Hunter. I mean, you know, whatever, it's part of my story. And it was great in some ways, but it was harsh from the students, like mega harsh. And I was one of like maybe 2 or 3 figure adjacent artists in the school. And it was just a hated category. I mean, really, it was just not, I mean, it wasn't like, how did one person describe it? Post-painterly abstraction, like op art, you know, influenced abstraction. Some of them were really good at it. And then video art, and the video artists hated the painters, and it just didn't feel good to be the person making the kind of work I was making, but I made it anyway, at least in school. And then a big shift was I switched from oil to acrylic.
I'm really curious about that too. Can you dive into that a little bit about making that transition, why you did it, how it worked for you? Yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. I, you know, undergrad in the very sort of traditional setting I was in, it was all about oil, all about materials and techniques. And I worked in a paint store, Williamsburg Paint, when it was on Elizabeth Street, late 90s. So again, like I accumulated more like geeky knowledge about paint. And it was some combination of moving out of my grad school studio and watching one of the 6-foot paintings I had worked on. And even back then, I had a tendency to be very indirect with how I would paint. It was layers, it was responding, it was being like, no, I don't like that, let's add more. And I wasn't so disciplined as to pay attention to all the rules you have to pay attention to when you're layering with oil. And so I watched this painting, basically the surface, flake off as I was moving it and trying to wrap it. And it was just a gut punch, you know, it was heartbreaking. So I just started to experiment with acrylic. And I knew enough about it to know that the layers adhered to each other, chemically speaking, and that I wouldn't run into that problem. And I came to just realize that that's whatever it is about acrylic, that kind of bonding, heavy duty bonding and durable surface, lended itself really well to my habit of painting over, and really knowing kind of early on that was part of my process, the layering.
Oh, that sounds like a really great move for you then, because that is one of the things that I just love is the surface of your paintings and how, like, I can see a move that had happened previously that then feeds the new move in a painting, and it just draws me in so I can keep looking at it. So I guess that really leads me to talking about what you're doing now and like what a day in the studio looks like for you at this point.
Um, yeah, well, it depends on the day.
Mhm, mhm,
And I like when I've done teaching, I like to talk about this. So I work on, you know, a variety of different scales. I use paper, I use small canvases, medium size, large. And the way I develop my paintings right now is really dependent on the works on paper. That's sort of, and the small paintings, that's sort of where I start working out a lot of my ideas. And I'm very aware that when I come into the studio, I don't really know who I'm going to get in terms of mood, personality, tolerance, patience level. So I have to have a lot of different options for myself in terms of like, I'm there, I am there to work, like
mhm.
no doubt about it. I might spend a little time on my phone or, looking at books or whatever, doing some image research. But the bulk of time I'm in my studio, I really like to be a worker. So am I desk oriented? Am I kind of not able to deal with scale and the whole body involvement necessary for a big painting? Then it's time to kind of like narrow down my focus and um really get into the details, right? And then some days I'm really impatient. I want to work big, but I'm not ready to kind of like, dive into the mind focus it takes to even like comprehend a composition on a large scale. So it's all about paintings on the floor, spill, just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I hate this. I don't think I can paint, but I'm just going to do it anyway. And when I'm in the city, I have fans going, so it speeds up the drying process. When I'm in our place in the country, I use the solar powered energy to dry my canvases, and they're out in our driveway, drying in the sun. And usually what I find is on those days where I feel really itchy and impatient and just like spazzo, I do a lot of things that I don't dare to do when I'm in a different kind of mood. And
Mhm.
I guess what I'm saying is I like to invite all of the different ways of working because they all hopefully come together in a finished painting. You can kind of go, oh, right, like there's this certain kind of behavior in paint, organized, literal. And then there's a place where the marks start to depart from the subject matter and become more abstract and spilly and
Mhm.
expressive.
I love how you're talking about like these different modes of working, because they're all you, they're all Jennifer, they're all kind of coming from your psyche. You are approaching them in different ways. And the idea also of like it's chance, but it's like, I know this sounds like hokey or whatever, but it's like Jennifer's chance. You know what I mean? Like it's made by your body still, it's made by what you're doing. And I love this idea of the spills happening that then may become something in your work. And I would love to hear, it sounds like you're working on your smaller work, you're working on your drawings. That really feeds your bigger pieces. But starting those drawings and those smaller ones, is it just responding to what's going on the surface and flipping it and then pulling images? Is that kind of how you're working in those smaller ones?
Yes, totally. I mean, and I start with spills, I start with spray paint, I start, with wet on wet, like pushing two pieces of paper together and seeing what happens. There's always a sort of charged ground that I like to start with. And when you think about, what am I finding? What am I responding to? Like it's chance, but it's not, right? Like
Mhm.
I'm I know what I'm interested in. I have a certain vocabulary and a range of subject matter that I'm researching, that I have images around me. I've got images on my phone, images in my head, and books that are open everywhere. So I'm finding things that I've never seen before, but I've also seen them before, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't know that it's going to be like a bird, let's say, but I've looked at so many depictions of birds. So it's sort of like my memory, my visual experience of responding to the ground that's there. And I like to think about divination practices in relation to that, like, you know, seeing images and telling yourself stories about the images you see. So, you know, it's a range of images that I look for, right?
I would love to hear a little bit more about that part of it too, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot in my own practice. And, I took this group of artists down to Mexico, and something I was really hoping we could all take away is when you see something and you were like, you are making a decision to kind of see something that sticks out to you, right? Like that's just your responding. And then it gets lodged in your memory and in your mind. And you could be painting 6 months from now and then be like, oh my gosh, like that, this is reminding me of such and such that I experienced. And it's not like you were, going home and sketching it or even sketching it there. It's just living in this space.
Totally.
And so, yeah, talking about, you said like divination practice of sorts, like I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Gosh, I love how you just described that. That is exactly what happens. It's like there's some sediment in our brain and we don't even realize what we're retaining until you get a prompt. And so I'm interested in this this word pareidolia. I can't remember where I heard it, but it's a cool sounding word, right? And it's basically like, when you look at the clouds in the sky and you see an animal, or you're looking into, bark on a tree and you see a face, or it's basically the human propensity to assemble something that's sort of random into an image or a story, and there are these ancient divination practices that we know about where, like, what's an example of one? Let's say necromancy, no, pyromancy, which is where like a diviner, somebody who's been given that role, let's say like in ancient Rome or something, they're looking into fire and smoke from the fire, and they're trying to sort of tease out images and ideas, and then tell a story about what's going to happen in the future, like the fortune telling thing. But if you look up ancient divination techniques, there's this huge, long, alphabetically organized list of like everything mancy, like whatever the prefix is with mancy. Mantic means to know. And it's like reading tea leaves, right? And there was a big interest in it in the 19th century with spiritualism, this surge of interest in popular culture and spiritualism, and seances and automatic drawing. Of course, we know like Hilma af Klint was really into that. And then it points towards the surrealists and all those surrealist techniques, which are very much connected to divination. And I find that fascinating, that abstract expressionism and the drip and all of these moves that we're familiar with in painting have this kind of spooky occult practice history to them. And that's what I'm thinking about. And sometimes when I'm really off my rocker trying to figure out a painting, and there's just like crusty, crazy surfaces and cracks and spills and layers, I'm really like, okay, what do you see? What do you see? And, I'm trying to have my own divination experience. And it's kind of crazed and awful sometimes. And then, it comes around the bend eventually, but it's...
I love that. I love it because I feel like artists who are involved in the process, right? Like I would say, because I'm a painter and I can speak best about painting, I would say painters who are process painters of sorts almost have to have that, whether they know if it's like the history or not. Like they have to be able to kind of see and pull things, right? To make it work. So I love hearing this because I'm like in that process in this painting back here. All of a sudden I'm like, oh shit, am I painting the fires that are happening that I'm reading about? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
these things that come in, and that as artists, we're, I don't know if I want to say channeling, but processing for like a larger group
Yeah,
sometimes, you
and
know, that sensitivity.
we have to allow, I feel like all of us make up these unarticulated rules for ourselves. Like, I know I'm not going to paint a bicycle. Like, and the reason I'm not is because it stresses me out. Not that I'm not interested in bicycles. I just, it like gives me an anxiety attack to think about. So I'm filtering, like my array of things that I'm going to paint is my array. It's limited, but we're filtering things out. We're always kind of, like you said earlier, lodging our, registering in our minds, whether it's from the news or from a trip or from the museum or something on Instagram. And yeah, we pull from it, and it's hard not, I mean, sometimes it feels like, oh God, am I doing that? Because I've made some forest fire paintings. But like we have to, and it's a chance often. I mean, I don't know if you feel this way, but it's a chance for me to sit with a lot of like horror and anxiety and mourning that I feel about the world. And, we have to deal with that,
Yeah, something I've been thinking about recently, because I was traveling a lot this summer, and so I was drawing on the road kind of, and hadn't been in my studio as much, and I felt this like anger rising in me kind of, and then I had a really great studio day because again, my kids are going back to school, I'm traveling, getting things settled, and I just felt like it was like kind of this weird rage session where I could just get stuff out about what's happening in our world, and processing all the things that are kind of going on politically speaking, internationally, so yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, and I definitely respond to it in terms of thinking about like it is a place where things are coming in, and we also have to release them, like onto the painting as well. So I think that's really interesting. And it kind of brings me to another question that I have for you, which is you were talking about there's different things that you have in your.
The image is kind of getting jumpy. Hang on one second.
Yep.
I'm just gonna. Oh, good. Okay. I just wanted to make sure my husband wasn't on the same internet connection. It's saying it's unstable. So but now it seems to be okay.
Okay.
Can you just repeat what you just said?
Sorry. Yeah, of course, no problem. So I was talking about, you were just referencing in your work that you have certain things that you're kind of, as we get further in our careers, there's things that come into our paintings and we allow in our paintings. You're saying a bicycle, no way, anxiety. And I love seeing the tombs in your paintings, and like these tigers, leopards that I see in your work sometimes, and of course the sculpture. And I had this question for you, which is, are they symbolic for you? Like, do you tend to combine different symbols to express something? Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yes, that is 100% accurate description. And I like the way that I have been thinking about it. And it's all kind of newish in my head, so it might not be super clear, but I'll give it a shot. I feel like for me to generate the paintings, there's a certain kind of juxtaposition, like a poetic juxtaposition, the way in a little poem you can travel all these different places, and there's like a music to the poetry when you first hear it, and then upon kind of like reflection and maybe, you know, research, you know, that there's you know, allusions and there's more going on than just how it sounds, but that meaning is revealed to you over time, closer looking. So in a similar way, I feel like, okay, there's the big read, the colors, the composition, like the drama from afar away. And then as you kind of move in closer, there's details, there's a variety of marks. And then there's also a level of different levels of recognizability to like place, plant life, you know, maybe you zoom in a little closer, you see the insects, you see the animals, you see like these different elements in the landscape. So within that intention, I have an array of characters, motifs that I'm thinking about. So the animals are either an animal that I have had a firsthand experience with, or they have a function within mythology that, you know, maybe they appear in mythology and in depictions of myths with a deity that I'm already interested in. For instance, the leopards they carry a chariot that Dionysus sits on. And I've already been thinking about Dionysus and Pan as these kind of nature gods, like gods of misbehavior, gods of like rules of society breaking down. And so the leopards can come in, and also I love cats. So they're like, you know, Jennifer avatars in a way. And also they are amazing abstract paintings, and like to have a yellow and black abstraction within like this larger field is, I love what that does visually. So each thing I pick sort of has to work on a few different levels for me. And as for the tombs or these portals, I had a big surgery in January where I had but like organs removed. Female organs removed. And it was intense. And part of my way of working through that was through making drawings and in, you know, recovering from that and thinking about the blank in the body. And I've been looking at these passage tombs, these ancient dolmens, where these large stones stacked on each other, or standing stones with like a big top on top, and like looking a lot at passage tombs and this idea of like the blank within the tomb and these rituals of people, like death rituals, going through them, people being buried, skeletons, along with like various items. I love to get on these research jags, like what are they buried with? Animal bones, cool. What are the animals? Are they buried with seeds? Yes, they are. What are the plants that grow nearby in that particular reason? Because it gets my brain going, right? Like collecting the imagery in my head. So they become these little poetic collections. Like what's the god that's going to be there? What's the animal? What's the plant life? And so it's all just kind of rolling around in my head. And so I was looking also for like a contemporary version of a dolmen, of a passage tomb, and I came upon these crazy abandoned World War II bunkers. And this whole like the architecture of the bunker, and there's bunkers abandoned in the woods in Europe, and there's even, anyway, they're all over the place. I became obsessed with these simple architecture. Sometimes they're stones, like the dolmens, and sometimes these kooky, like recessed, like rectangles and little portals for like the guns to kind of poke out. And just thinking about like the bunker as this paranoid place of hiding and like war, murder, hoarding food, you know, hiding, being afraid and wanting to kill others, and like just what a weird twist that is on the ancient reasons for having these kinds of shapes in the landscape. This is a very long answer.
I love it though. I love it. I love hearing all the things. I love research as well. So I'm like, here, I can geek out with it.
It's so fun. So then I started drawing and painting the bunker portals and realizing like, it doesn't matter what you like, people don't need to know they're abandoned World War II bunkers. Mm-hmm. They're weird. They're like these weird little geometric condensations in the woods. It's a chance for me to use like a different kind of shape, logic, way of painting. They suggest a hiding place. Like they're suggestive. Let's just say that. And so, you know, what does that have to do with a leopard? I don't know. But in my head, botany, specificity of plant, like, you know, deity or animal from myth. Like, have I had a firsthand experience with the animal? Maybe I have goldfinches, like not necessarily in myth, but in the Jennifer experience. So what am I trying to say? There's a poetry in the collision of these different elements for me. And I have to find my own weird reasons for putting them in the painting. Like they can't just be there randomly. They have to like represent something within my iconography and have this kind of juxtaposition with each other.
Well, I think that's another reason I've really been attracted to your work. And it was great, you know, seeing a couple of your pieces in that recent show, because there was the tomb, which was this wonderful, like you said, portal is how I was reading it. Like, where's this going to go? Is it going to go to the quote unquote other side? Is this going in here? And then there was a sculpture that was like inverted with like a red glow around it. And so there's all these narratives that you can begin to kind of pull from it with the color. And it's of course my narrative, but because I think you're very clear on your influences, my reading becomes very similar in some ways to like what you're describing, of course, you know, like this idea of hiding. Like that was something I kept thinking of when I was looking at it, like this hiding. Did they not make it there to hide? You know, what happened? Like what was, is this like suggesting with the red around it, like this, like death is, and then of course, you know, I can put on my feminist lens because that's who I am, you know, as well. And then reading that because it's this like fallen female sculpture. So I think that's beautiful, like how, and it was very poetic because then I can also just read it as like looking at it as a painting and the surface and how you had like these wonderful forms. They were like these white forms. They were kind of prickly looking and they ride on the surface and they also feel so foreign looking when you look at them, you know? So I love how you do that as well to create this space and tension in your paintings.
Yeah, thanks. I like all those descriptions. That was cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, surface activation, right? Like that's important to me. You know, that's a whole other weird like rabbit hole of God, the like magic of fucking paint. Okay. Like how it can just be this pustular, like textury, crusty thing, but then it can also just feel like vapors and like just how you can describe something and then that thing is kind of disappearing as you're describing it, like a figure just becomes part of the crustiness or I just love what paint can do. And yeah, that's part of the fun for me. And I guess really part of the story of it is like decay, you know, things coming into focus and then disappearing, you know, like a ruined building. Like, you know, it was something, you kind of know what it was / sort of still is, but it's going away at the same time.
Yeah, for me, looking at your work too, there is like that overlap of time, you know, because I can see like there was a move here that happened. I can kind of feel it. But then it becomes part of something else. And so it's like, while I'm able to be in your painting, it's just not like an image. It's like being in the painting and seeing like a, time overlaps, which I think is really incredible. And it makes you think of another question. So I told you, I was in Mexico with these artists. It was really wonderful. And we could talk about painting, and we were like all sitting having a margarita at night. And somebody had the question, when do you know a painting is done? And it became this big conversation. And so I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts? Like, when do you know that a painting is done? Is it ever done? Do you feel it at a certain point? How do you kind of describe that for your own process?
God, isn't that like the most mysterious question that you can ever think of? It's so crazy. I mean, it reminds me of this. Did you ever see that Gerhard Richter documentary where he's painting? There's one part where he's working on a painting. It looks like one thing, and he's like, that is finished for today, for this week. But when he came back to it, he's like, it's just not finished for months. I mean, I'm not quoting him, but I understand what that means for me, which is like a painting that's okay for today or for 1 week very much might not be okay in 3 months. Like, it may not be finished. So the ideal, I think, is to let something sit, to have much, like a lot of time to sit and look at it. Because something that I think is good at the end of one day, I'm sure you know this, everyone knows this, come the next day, you're like, what was I thinking? That's horrible. You just get used to, you see the painting differently as it like sits with you. So all that said, I've had paintings that I think were finished, sad to admit this, but, have been shown and come back. And I'm like, oh, it's not finished. And luckily Jared, who runs Hainu, who I love, he's cool.
He's great.
He's like, Jen, I see it. Like, I get it. Everything you did improved the painting. Like, he's so supportive of my process. And I really appreciate that. And so, yeah, I mean, some paintings, a month after they're done, they feel done in a year, and that's cool. And other paintings, I just go, hey, like this 8-foot canvas was expensive. If I don't love you, then why don't I just work into you?
Yeah. I mean, if I don't love you and you're going to take up this space, like we've got to work something out. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's okay. And I think as to like, when is it really done? Like, it's when something's not needling me when I look at it. It's like, what's wrong with this? Something's wrong. It's like, you need to just feel kind of enamored with it. You need to look at it and feel a kind of flow, which is hard to articulate. You know what I mean?
Oh, I do. I work on multiple pieces at the same time, mainly because of that, I feel like, for me anyway. And sometimes a painting is done, but I've also had this recent experience, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, where there was like these paintings I made. I was probably like 8 years ago or something. And I was like, these are shit. I can't stand them, blah. And I was moving. So I just kind of threw them in there. And then I moved, and I didn't find them until like just recently. And I'm like, oh, wow, like there's some interesting things happening here that I hated then, but now I'm interested in it. You know what I mean? Like, isn't that funny how that can happen?
That's cool. And that's great. I mean, that's an argument for not painting over everything you ever made.
I wanted to paint over it. I wanted to like get rid of them, but I was like, no, like reuse the surface or something, maybe.
There was a reason you kept them. Yeah, no, I do know what you mean. And I think over the years, there are paintings, obviously, that have made the cut that I do enjoy going back and looking at and being like, wow, like that was a weird phase in your work. And
That's
cool.
what it is. It's like, that's what I was seeing. I was like, that was really weird. It's something I probably wouldn't do now, but I guess I'm glad I did it,
But
like.
I really believe we contain all those different phases. Like whatever we're doing, even if it to us, I think, oh my God, I've so changed my work. And as someone who has so changed their work, and people will be like, I don't get it. Like, why did you paint lasagna and candy bars? And now it is fairy time in the woods. And, good question, like fair question, right? But I feel like my work now contains all the phases, like how I can go back to undergrad and go, oh, wow, I was drawing casts and animals. And I have a little jokey reason why the food paintings are still with me, or I had to make them. And it's because I say I had to pass through the cheese field. Okay. Like cheese, like it was when I was making those painting, cheese and cream, right? Like that's like this process, sort of weird. It was material and kind of color, like the color is crazy of like those fake orange Velveeta cheese sauces. And I liked this idea that they were becoming atmosphere, that were like enveloping you, especially as the scale increased. Like you've got like a icing or cream cheese or whatever it is. And there was an expression of materials that I was able to mess around with in those food paintings. There was material invention that I allowed myself that I don't think I allowed in as much in previous bodies of work. And I feel like that's still there in my work now, a kind of like maybe confectionery or sauce driven.
Like sauce driven. Can we like make that a term?
I mean,
in the sauce driven painting here in this area. But no, I know what you're saying. Like, because you allowed yourself to go into that world, you could be in a different space that you couldn't be in any other way. And therefore, we're talking about paint and how magical and incredible it is. You got to turn it into that. And then you're gonna, like, even your hand and just processing and making it that way then can come into this work, which may not have like those like incredible layers maybe, or like the texture. I mean, you have a lot of texture and like there's like grittiness in parts, and then in other areas, like I love, like you'll have what starts to almost feel like this super soft cloudy area that is overlapping like these harder areas. So it's like two in one. I don't know. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is like, having that experience, you're right. We can then everything that we do, just like we were talking about, everything that we see, we pick up on certain things, and then they can move forward in our paintings and make them what they are,
And I think in a certain way, of course, as we get older and the longer we engage with the medium, we accumulate more ideas and more skills and more knowledge. But there's a certain kind of way that we paint, that each person paints. And like, I always really liked kind of big expanses of mess, and then like very like small brush pattern or detail. And I've always been interested in like, how many different ways can I use the paint in one painting? So my way of addressing the medium hasn't really changed like that much. It's just, what am I deciding to use as the structure within which to explore what I'm interested in, but use the paint the way I want to use the paint, right?
I love that. That brings me to one of my last questions that I have for you, although I could keep talking about painting all day.
I know,
it's been great. I love it. I like sure, like getting all these ideas, and it's just awesome. I love it. You're also a musician. I love listening to you occasionally on Instagram.
Thanks.
And I think a lot of artists have always wanted to be musicians, a lot that I talk to anyway, a lot of painters, because there's this other it's similar but different, because you get to work with others in a way that we don't, when we're in our studio. So, and there's a performance aspect too, like, can you tell me a little bit about also playing and if that impacts your work at all, or how you see the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny question because I think when I originally started thinking about that, I'm like, I don't understand what they have to do with each other, but of course they have so much to do with each other. And for me, I mean, I started playing violin when I was 5, and there was a lot of discipline involved in learning how to play classical violin, and auditioning and getting ranked and whatever. Like I was really into it. I was really serious about it. And I practiced. And I think that's where I learned a lot of my discipline in the studio. Like you have to be self-motivated to practice, to, pull out your instrument and look at something that appears to be too difficult, but you break it down into little steps and then you can do it. So I think that grooved a pathway in my brain to be able to do that as a painter. But then coming back to it as an adult, I think there's a level of attunement to the present moment that you have as a musician, whether that's playing, rehearsing, collaborating, or performing. You tune into the other musicians when you're performing, you tune into the audience, and you are in the moment. Like that is your main responsibility, is to always come back to the moment. And I think that has helped me be a little more risk taking in the studio and be like, okay, just go for it. Here you are. Like, this is it. You just have right now, you're like an Olympic athlete with your brush. You got this, because sometimes we have to really psych ourselves up. So I think there's something about that. And just in playing music, I like simple patterns. I like to find expressiveness within pattern.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some of that in my work, in my paintings as well. So
I love that. Again, it's always just I really enjoy listening to you play or play with others, and trying to envision myself in that space too, because it feels like a really special space that you're having with the other musicians. You can kind of feel that coming through. Yeah. And actually, speaking of working with other musicians, one of the last things I'd like to ask you is if there's any artists that you'd like to give a shout out to. I know there's always so many, but I always love to ask artists who are on there if they'd like to give a shout out to others, other artists who may have impacted them, or they might be kind of doing studio visits right now and it's been special, or anything like that.
yeah, well, I was thinking about that because you had asked that, and I love that question. And I realized, like, okay, there's my peers, and there's a certain array of female painters that are my faves, and it's just like by happenstance that they're women, and they're in my general age range. But I find I love Lisa Sanditz's paintings. Like I don't know, I'm always amazed by her inventiveness and humor and spontaneity in her work. She's a friend, I'm lucky enough to say. And Jackie Gendel, I just love, again, like a level of inventiveness and like just weird decisions and an engagement with art history. I think as a geek for early, modernist paintings and maybe lesser known works by familiar modernist artists, I feel like I recognize a lot of sources, or if not sources, just things that she's looking at. And I just find myself always being like, oh, God damn, Jackie, like, great painting. And Elizabeth Glassner is someone else whose work I really love. And I feel like we're in some kind of shared zone of, what can paint do and how does it cohere to make a body, and kind of like exploring the mythology around the embodied female body, right? Like, how has it been depicted? How does it sort of like become a byproduct of the landscape it's in and the painterly medium? So those are some that come to mind. And I do love Inka Essenhei's work as well, even though like I think I find more kinship in what she's painting than how she's painting, because I'm such a more like messy, process oriented painter. But there's a lot of, you know, like motifs and nature worship and all kinds of things like that I feel real kinship with in her work.
Yeah, her paintings are beautifully like, I mean, yeah, she's got that surface, you know, down in a certain way.
Detail, that's hallucinatory, insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I'd love to look at it. And I'm like, also just not how I apply paint, you know what I mean? But
yeah, like I totally respect it and I'm dazzled.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I just think, oh yeah, like that's not how I would paint that, you know, that tree, like whatever. And it's fine. I mean, it's great, you know, it's just a whole different set of skills that I don't have.
Yeah.
And I think about her a lot. I'll be painting something, I'm like, oh, I think, you know, a thistle. I've seen Inka paint that. And I'm like, so kind of like clumsy and direct, and like that's fine. It's just funny to me.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying there. Like 100% feel that. Yeah, I saw her show. When was that? Like over the summer or
yeah, like spring, late spring
time. Oh, crazy. But yeah, beautiful show. I mean, just her, and the scale of her paintings too. I thought that was really interesting to see. Which I wish we had time to talk about scale in your paintings, because that's something else I was thinking about, is seeing the smaller paintings and the bigger ones. But I do want to thank you for the time that you've spent here today, just talking about your work and sharing more about your process and building paintings and thoughts on painting. So thank you so much, Jennifer.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It's really just, I mean, it's kind of the best part about our lives as artists, is to speak with peers and feel like we have commonality and geek out.
Yes, geek out about all the incredible things that paint can do and the history of it. So, oh my gosh. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. And before we jump off here, can you share with us where we can find you online, or if you have anything coming up that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, well, I am going to be in a 3-person show at Denny Gallery in November, which I'm really excited about. And then there's a solo show in the works for next spring that I'm not prepared to talk about all the details because they haven't been finalized, but it looks like it's going to be a 2-gallery show with High Noon and another space. Hush, hush.
Very cool. That's very cool.
But I'm really looking forward to both of those things, and feel excited.
Great. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, and I will let you get back to your work. Have a great day.
You have a great day too.